Here to talk to you about plugins. Really, all they are is they're a way to package together everything about an application. All right, like I said, a way to package together everything about an application, all the database tables and columns in those things, any scripts, the UI surrounding it, forms, bits of forms, any out-of-box data that we want to ship with an application, any demo data that shows how it works. That all together comprises a plugin. Each plugin gets a directory with its own ID. The ID has to be unique, otherwise things work rather poorly. And a plugin gets defined in a single file, the plugin.xml file that you'll find in the top of the plugin directory, which outlines any dependencies on other plugins that might have to be installed first before we can install our plugin. Any scripts that plugin uses and no other plugins necessarily need to use, they can just be put here instead of in a more global location. It defines who can activate the plugin. It provides a link from the activation dialog to our wiki if necessary. It's totally optional, and any metadata about that plugin. I'll get into that in a little more detail in a bit. All plugins used to be in a single bucket in the Glide package. It was just Glide/plugins, and they were all there. So several hundred of them. They have since been broken out as part of a modularization effort, so developers can check out only the projects that they need and not clutter up their workspace with half a thousand plugins. Kind of what I just said. They all used to be there, and now they're there, broken out. The directory structure of a plugin has one or more optional folders. A plugin doesn't need any of these folders. It can just be a single plugin.xml file that installs other plugins. But if there's more to a plugin than just that, these are the folders that they'll go into, and I'll talk about each of these in turn. Dictionary is where we stick table definitions. A table gets defined all at once in a single XML file, and there you can see every column in this table, the type of column it is, anything else that needs to define those columns all go in this single file for a table. Really easy to go see tons of examples of these if you want to. A standard that we have here, and it may not be obvious, but if something is, when we're creating a column from a file like this, if something is the default, for example, type string, we don't put it in here. So if for any of these columns where you don't see a type, that type's going to be a string. Not necessarily obvious to somebody new coming in, but it is a convention that we've had since day one, and it sounds like something that Fred is not likely to want changed anytime soon. So just be aware of that. If you don't see something here, it's going to default to whatever the default happens to be. And I don't have a list of what those defaults happen to be, unfortunately. The UI.html folder is where we stick any client-side CSS or JavaScript files specific to our plugin. For example, in the currency plugin that you see here, we have a script, glide filter currency, which does something apparently, and that's where we stick it. UI.jforms are where we stick any hard-coded UI pages that we want to have available to our plugin. If you're familiar with UI pages, those are things in the database that a customer can actually access and modify if they want, but we do have several pages that we don't want anybody changing, and so we stick them hard-coded in the UI.jforms folder. Similar to that, but a little bit smaller, we've got the UI.jtemplates, which is the hard-coded analog to UI macros, if you're familiar with those. Smaller bits of XML that can get included into larger pages. The sys.scripts folder is not commonly used, but if you want, after your plugin gets installed, if you want something to appear in scripts background as a script that can be clicked on and run, this is the folder to put it in. And then as you'll see, it'll show up as an option in scripts background when you go there. The unload folder is where we stick any XML artifacts that we want unloaded as part of this plugin. They get unloaded once. The first time the plugin gets activated, these files get unloaded into the database, and then any changes to them will not propagate to a customer when they upgrade. This is useful for things that we might want to change in the future, but we don't want to modify behavior on people who have already activated that plugin. We just want the behavior to take place going forward from this point on for new instances. Unload.demo, little bit different. Customer gets an option whether or not to install this folder when they activate the plugin. If somebody is a prospect, they might want all the demo data that shows how a plugin works, but if they're heavily in production, they might not want all the stuff that's in here because it's going to change things that they may be relying on. So unload.demo is optional and appears as an option in the plugin activation dialog. The update folder, kind of like the unload folder, only it gets applied every upgrade. So if we change something in here and the customer hasn't modified it, they'll get our new copy when they upgrade. If they have modified it, they will not get our copy. It's one of the strengths of our upgrade. And those are the folders I just went over. Here's an example plugin.xml file. This is, like I said, what I said before, the metadata that defines how a plugin behaves. A few things of note in here. The ID, it's the unique ID I talked about before. The name is just a more friendly name that customers can see and identify with. Invalidate properties is an attribute that you can put in if you are, say, shipping another copy of a property that's giving that property a different value when your plugin gets activated. We're not necessarily going to flush the properties cache when every plugin gets installed. So if you find that you activate a plugin and you're not getting your new property value you expect, you're going to want to add the invalidate properties attribute here. This is just one example of that in the context help plugin. We want to provide a different value for the help default page. And so we set this invalidate properties to true, so the properties cache gets flushed when the plugin gets activated and everyone is happy. If you need to run an arbitrary JavaScript file that you write after your plugin gets activated, after it gets totally loaded, you can use the afterload attribute here. And then if you stick a JavaScript file with this name in the, I think it's the UI HTML, I'm going to go back and find it. Yeah, I think it's going to be in the UI.html / sorry for this confusion here. Scripts, yeah. That attribute that we just saw, and I'll flip all the way back here, sorry again. That JavaScript file will get executed at the end of your plugin activations. It's kind of simple. I don't think it's used very often. I'd be surprised if it were used in more than 5 plugins in the entire system, but it's available and if necessary. Help and description will show up in the plugin activation dialog. The customer will see when they go to activate it. Help is, if you like, the name of a wiki article, and we'll provide a link to that article from the activation dialog. And the description just shows up as the description. Here's one example. The data policy plugin has a help attribute and a description there, and it shows up in the activation dialog. The learn more is the link to the wiki with this data underbar policy value that you see here, and it will link to a wiki page called data policy. Just a way to let an admin of a customer instance know what they're getting into if they activate this thing. Version and provider name don't do anything. Use them or don't. Don't know why they don't do anything. Okay, there are 4 easy ways to find out what plugins are active in a given instance. The first one is xmlstats.do, which has a lot of information, but if you put the include equals plugins in the URL there, you'll see just plugin information, and here you get the installation date and ID of every plugin active in the system. This gets reported back to Hi, like everything in XML stats, every 5 minutes from every instance in our farm. There's a sys underbar plugins table in the instance, and this also is a list of activated plugins and their activation date and ID. There's a system definition plugins module where you'll see a list of all plugins, not just the active ones, and this is where an admin goes to activate new plugins. In the 4th place, remember I said that XML stats gets reported every 10 minutes to Hi. We actually do something with it. That's kind of useful. There's an instance management application with an instance plugins module where you can go and open up a single plugin and get a list of every instance that's installed it and when they installed it. Doesn't really tell you if it's being used, but it tells you whether it's been activated or not, which can be useful. Plugins can be in a repository called glide-sandbox if it's something that many developers want to work on it at the same time. This is kind of an artifact from before we used Git, back when we used CVS. With Git now, it's a lot easier to have your own development branch to work on, but so I don't know if anybody actually uses Glide Sandbox anymore, but here is where you can stick stuff that will not be packaged up as part of the nightly build or as part of the war. So there's no fear that a customer could ever get access to something in here if there's something you just want to play around with, but you don't want to have it on your laptop. Like I said, with the use of Git these days, it's kind of irrelevant now. All right, a bunch of plugins get installed out of box for everybody. We have a set of platform plugins, we have a set of application plugins, and the list of those plugins get defined in two sort of meta plugins, com.glide.core and com.snc.core. These are two plugins that don't have any of those optional plugin directories that I told you about. All they have is a plugin.xml file, which lists a laundry list of dependent plugins. And when this plugin on the screen here gets installed, the plugins that you see there are going to get activated in order. So at the end of it all, you end up with a freshly debooted system with all the plugins that we want a customer to have. You'll see this load equals boot attribute on a couple of them. That's a way we can designate that a plugin gets activated for new instances only, but nobody upgrading is automatically going to get it. They might optionally go activate it themselves, but say we update our security manager, we're not necessarily going to want to change that for anybody already in production, but we do want to have it be the default for any new instances going forward, so we use this load equals boot attribute. Some plugins can be installed by a customer or admin. Some can only be installed by us, by main users hopping into the instance. And that's done with the state attribute in the plugin.xml file, like that. If the state is published, that means an admin is going to see it when they go to system definition plugins module. If the state is development or there is no state at all, it's a main only thing. Useful for things where we just kind of want to limit the rollout initially. We want to get a few customers running it and get some feedback, so we don't want everybody just jumping on it all at one time. Plugins are forever. Kind of a sticky point with some customers, but once you activate it, there's no going back. The better plugins will have sort of a gating property that says use my plugin true or false that a customer could turn off and essentially deactivate all the functionality of the plugin, but a lot of plugins don't have that. So if you're writing a plugin, I highly recommend having a property that can be turned off to sort of cover our butts. But there is one exception to this. I talked about the sys plugins table that is a record in the instance of what's been activated. If you delete the entry in this table for a specific plugin and then restart all nodes of the instance will no longer think that that plugin is active. It doesn't undo anything. It doesn't take any scripts away. It doesn't remove any tables or forms or lists or anything like that, but it can be a way of sort of I'm not saying this right, but unwinding behavior. I mean, if the system has a check, whether or not a given plugin is active before doing something, that check will now come back false if you delete this entry. And for testing locally, if you want to activate your plugin again and get all the stuff in the unload folder that remember you only get one crack at, you can delete that entry, restart your instance, and then you can get all the stuff in the unload folder again without having to run a full zboot first, which can save time. And that's that table I was just talking about, the sys plugins table there. And that's all I got.